Welcome to Rare But Real, where we discuss what it takes to be a woman of God in these challenging days. And now, please welcome your host, Audrey Brogy.
Hey there, this woman writes and says, I'd love to hear a talk about how older women can be faithful wives when their previously faithful husbands have become lukewarm Christians who continue to proclaim faith, but who no longer want to be involved in the church and who are mostly living for themselves. Hobbies, TV, watching sports, no true passion for the Lord, and yet they present to others as though they are godly and faithful. I am living this. I want to be a godly wife. My husband really doesn't want to be involved in any church ministry that involves any kind of commitment. He's retired from his secular job, and he was so beat up there. He's exhausted, but he's now isolated, and he's not seeking Christian friends or fellowship. He'd prefer to be alone and do his own thing. We're now entering several years of retirement. He's had lots of time to rest. I pray, of course, but what should my posture be? I pray about this every day. Maybe other older women are in similar places. He knows Scripture and was once an elder, so I'm concerned for him and pray daily, Lord, please don't let him live in the dark. And I love your podcast. Thank you. You know, I am very sorry that you are living this, and you're right. Other older women live this as well. I know of not just older women who are dealing with this with their husbands, but I also know of older people in retirement who are both living this way. They were super involved in the church life and so involved, but then they reach a age and stage where they don't want to be involved anymore. And I don't know what the reason for that is. I know sometimes maybe it's health reasons, and that's of course legitimate if you cannot be there. But some become, just as you said about your husband, they just isolate themselves and just want to live for themselves, which is really, really sad. But let me say a couple of things as we talk about this topic. Number one, you cannot change your husband. Doesn't matter what age or stage of life you're in, whether you are a young woman who is listening to this, or whether you're in the middle years listening to this, whatever age or stage, you cannot change your husband. Now, all of us have a tendency as wives to want to see things in our husbands that we want to change. Sometimes it's a major issue as what you're describing here. Sometimes it's less major issues, but just areas of their lives that we wish they would think differently, or we wish they would respond differently, or we wish they would do fill in the blank differently. We don't always know what's right. It's not like we're, the best in figuring those things out. But you have to decide, if he never changes, how are you going to live your life? And you have to remember also as a believer that you are accountable to the Lord for your obedience. You are not accountable to the Lord for his obedience. And I know that's a simple statement, but it's so true. And sometimes it's so, it just changes our perspective that you are only accountable to the Lord for yourself. So I would encourage you to live according to 1 Peter chapter 3. I know I've talked about this before on the podcast, but it bears repeating because it is so applicable to what you are going through. Now, I'm going to assume that your husband is certainly a believer, but I never want to leave out the possibility that it's possible that he's not. Lots of times people claim to know the Lord and even quote unquote live for the Lord, and they do all the right things and they serve in leadership positions and everything else, but they haven't truly been born again. I mean, we even see that, in terms of, Judas Iscariot, how he was one of the 12, but yet he was never a believer. And I don't say that to judge your husband. He could very well be a believer, and he probably is, and he's probably just living in disobedience now. But never rule that out in terms of your prayers for him, that maybe he needs to come to know the Lord in his fullness, that he really needs to understand the gospel. Sometimes people even can understand it with their head and they can share the gospel, but they've never truly embraced it for themselves. And so I can't really speak to that except to say, pray for that as well as you are praying for him. And in fact, when you look at 1 Peter chapter 3, you see that that's one of the things that Peter talks about when he talks to these wives. And this is a time of life where, he's talking about living in general with people who mistreat you and people who are not living the way they should. And that's what he deals with in chapter 2. But then when he moves into chapter 3, he starts talking to the wives, and he's talking to women who are living with disobedient husbands. Some of them, they're living with unsaved husbands, that maybe they've come to faith in Christ, but their husbands have not. And so he's dealing with that. But the application is the same too for women who are living with believing husbands who are disobedient. And the passage says that, and this goes to my point of saying that that you are accountable for your obedience to the Lord, because in this passage, he doesn't say, wait for your husband to change and live this way. No, he says, live this way while your husband is disobedient. And that's what he says. He says, you be submissive to them. You still have an attitude of submission towards your husband. You respect him, and that in his disobedience, however that takes shape, he can be won without a word by the behavior of your wives. And that's why I say, and I often remind women, don't nag your husbands into the kingdom. Don't nag them into obedience to the Lord, because it doesn't work anyway. Whatever we think it's going to work, but it doesn't. It only sends them typically further away, and where they double down sometimes. But what God says in his word is that they will be won without a word, and obviously it doesn't mean you don't talk at all. Okay, so let's put that caveat in there. But the emphasis is on the behavior of a wife who is submissive, who has that deference to her husband, deference to her husband. And then he says, as they observe, because they're living with you, they're watching you, your chaste and respectful behavior. So there it is. Submission, you see it in the first verse. Then you see chaste, you see that in the second verse. And then you see the respectful word also in the second verse. And then he goes and talks about the way a woman presents herself in a physical way. He tells her that the emphasis shouldn't just be on the external things she does, how she looks on the outside, braiding her hair, wearing gold jewelry, putting on dresses. He's not saying that you don't do those things. He's just saying that's not where the emphasis needs to be. The emphasis, and here's the other part that's hard for us as women, it's the hidden person of the heart. And then he calls that the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit. And then he goes further and says that is precious in the sight of God. I love that because, again, he talks about the part of a woman that you can't see. You can see the outward appearance. You can see what she's hanging from her ears. You can see what she's doing to her hair. You can see all the makeup she puts on her face. You can see the clothing that she wears. But the part that speaks volumes is what's going on the inside, and God calls that the hidden person of the heart. And then he further defines it by calling it the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit. And again, he's not talking about personality here. Oh, you're just a woman who's always quiet. He's talking about that she has this quiet trust in the Lord, because that's what he goes on to explain. This quiet trust in the Lord, who puts her faith in the Lord, and she's not frightened by any fear because her hope is in God. That's what the next verses tell us. And of course, then that passage goes on and talks specifically to the husbands, how they're to live with their wives and how they are to honor them as a fellow heir in the grace of life, reminding them that they are weaker, not necessarily weaker in their spirit, but they're weaker people. And that's okay. That's not a slam. It's like, I remember Dr. Adrian Rogers saying, the difference between a porcelain cup and burlap or something like that. That women are like the porcelain cups and men are more like burlap. And then he says that their prayers will be hindered if they don't live with their wives in that way. But then I like even further as he goes in this chapter, because then he says here, and I think this is such an application for you as you're living this way, he says, he begins quoting Proverbs 34. It's not Proverbs, it's Psalm 34. And he says, when he says, to sum up, all of you, wives and husbands, be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit, not returning evil for evil or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead, for you were called for this very purpose, that you might inherit a blessing. Sometimes where we see ways that our husbands are failing, or they're not doing what they ought to do, or they're being disobedient in some way, shape, or form, we often want to insult them. We often want to say something negative to them about their behavior. But God says, no, give them a blessing instead. Look for something that you can praise them for. Look for a way that you can build them up. That's a blessing that you give to them. And then he goes on and says, because you are called for this very purpose, that you might inherit a blessing. And then that's when he goes on and quotes the psalm. And I love that, because that's what he wants us to do. And then in verse 15, he says, sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart, always being ready to make a defense to everyone, and that includes your husband, who asks to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. And so you take that and you apply it in your marriage. And he continues and he says, keep a good conscience, so that in the thing in which you are slandered, even if that's happening with your husband, those who revile your good behavior, because I wanted to point out, that's why I kept reading, that here it is on the behavior again, your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame. And so you think about that even you don't nag your husband, you're not calling out what he's doing is wrong. You're living your life for the Lord, and you hope and pray that the way you honor him, respect him, give him blessings, that God will use that in his life to win him over. So, and then I would encourage you to pray and fast according to Matthew chapter 6. You should read those verses, because that's where God gives the instructions when he says, when you pray, don't be like hypocrites. They love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners so that they may be seen by men. I say, don't do that. He says, you pray, you go into your inner room, close your door, and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Do that as it concerns these areas with your husband. Because again, if you are, and don't tell him you're doing this, well, I'm praying for you. Obviously you want your husband to know you pray for him in general for his life, but in this area that is burdening you, you pray in secret to the Lord about that. And you ask the Lord for his grace in that and how you are to behave. And you pray 1 Peter chapter 3 for yourself, that you would live this way in front of your husband. And then, of course, the fasting part, pick a day. Sometime, I don't know what your health situation is, but pick a day that you're actually setting aside eating, because you are so burdened by what's going on in your husband's life, because you care for his soul. Not just that it would make your life better and you would be in this together, but you care for his soul. And so again, you follow those directions. You don't put on a gloomy face. You don't say, hey, I'm fasting for you. I'm not eating because, you're in disobedience. No, you don't do any of that. He doesn't even know you're doing that, but you pray and fast for him. And then also I would encourage you, realize too, that you could fall into this same trap, like 1 Corinthians chapter 10, when God talks about the Israelites, but he says, let everyone take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you, but that which is common to man. That any of these, we can't look at him living his life out of fellowship with the body of believers, that couldn't happen to you. It could. So you pray for that for yourself, knowing that you could fall into that same thing. And yes, because he has isolated himself, that's another reason why, pray if he doesn't know the Lord, that God would wake him up, and that if he is, to use an old-fashioned Baptist term, if he is backslidden, pray that God would restore to him the joy of his salvation, as David prayed, that God would restore that in his life. That could be part of what you're praying and fasting over. And then, but I would be concerned, these are things to pray for, because, true believers, they can go through periods of despondency. Believers can go through periods where maybe people have hurt their feelings, or they're dealing in sin and they don't want to be around other believers, whatever. But in the general sense, believers who love Christ and who are walking with him want to be with other believers. So that's concerning. What is that saying about your husband? That's another thing that you should pray for, that God would restore the joy, if he's saved, that God would restore the joy of his salvation, and that he would be the type of man who would want to surround himself with believers. And having said all of that, know too that Jesus tells us that our joy is not dependent on our circumstances. Our joy is not dependent on the way other people are living. Our joy is only dependent upon the Lord. That's why he says, in me you have joy. I have come that your joy will be made full. That's what he tells his disciples. In fact, I would encourage you to go read John chapter 14, 15, all when he's talking to his disciples and preparing them for his journey to the cross, because there's so much in there. Even the verse is in there that says, in this world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. So even in your marriage, you can think about that. You're having some tribulation because you care about your husband so much. You know what he's missing, but you can still experience the joy of the Lord. And remember the Apostle Paul in Philippians, because he's in jail. He's chained to a guard. But even in those circumstances, he's not only rejoicing in the Lord himself, but he's telling the Philippians, but by way of God writing this epistle for all of us, he's telling us that we can rejoice in the Lord. Why? Because God is near, because God cares, and you can cast all your care upon him because he cares for you. And this is a reminder too to all of you who are listening who are much younger, to prepare for the older years of your life. Sometimes when you're young, you just think, oh, that's just for older people. No, you're going to get there. Unless you die young, God takes you home young, or unless he comes for his church first, you will reach these older years. You will reach a time in life where you may be tempted to just throw your hat in and not be a part of anything in the church anymore. But that's not right. And you should, ask the Lord to always, 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 always give you the joy of your salvation. And sometimes even if you're not experiencing that joy, you do what God tells you to do anyway, because that's why he says, he has my commandments and obeys them. He is the one who loves me, and he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I too will love him and show myself to him. I love that passage because there's nothing in there about feelings. There's nothing like, okay, well, when you feel like you have my commandments, and when you feel like obeying them, obey me. Or I know you don't have to obey me right now because you're going through a hard time in your life. No. And you know what often happens, or what I think in my experience happens, is as I obey the Lord, my feelings run and catch up with my obedience. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time, because I can be a stubborn, rebellious person, but I am always to obey the Lord even when I don't feel like it. And so there's probably times with this woman who wrote in where you don't feel like, respecting your husband. You don't feel like honoring him. You don't feel like giving him a blessing because he's in disobedience, and you just wish y'all could go to church together and magnify the Lord together. That's the beginning of Psalm 34, that you want to magnify the Lord together with your husband. And that's not happening for you right now, but you can still magnify the Lord with other saints. And one other thing before I close out my answer is just make sure that you don't gossip about your husband to other people. I'm sure you probably have trusted friends and an older woman. All of us, even though the older I get, the more I realize I'm going to be the oldest of the old. But still, there'll be trusted people, a woman maybe that is a vault that you could talk to because you want things to be better, that could pray with you. But just don't, and even if people ask, why doesn't your husband come in church anymore? You just protect your husband. Love covers a multitude of sins. And, you share what you can share that still honors him, but that doesn't throw him under the bus. So that's my answer for this week. I hope it's an encouragement to you. And as always, if you have other questions, just send them my way, and I'm happy to respond to you personally, set up a phone appointment. But I love handling these on the podcast because I know there's so many other women who are wondering the same things.
If you enjoyed this episode of Rare But Real, be sure to subscribe so that you will be notified when a new episode is posted. Please consider taking a moment to leave a review, as it helps others discover the podcast. Follow Audrey on Instagram and Facebook at Rare But Real, and listen to all of her messages on the Search the Scriptures app.